This morning, we are going to be talking about an issue that is very rarely discussed in the halls of Congress or the Senate, and that is the need to reduce the standard work week in the United States.
We're here today because for 84 years, there's been no reduction in the standard work week. Since 1950, the productivity of the American worker has risen by 400%, yet full-time employees still log an average of 41.9 hours a week.
When people reach the end of their lives, they never say, I wish I'd have made more money. What they wish for is they wish they had more time. And that's what work does. You know, work, we are paid for our time. And when we work, we are sacrificing time with other people, with family, friends, and other things we wish to do.
The 5-day work week is not an immutable law of nature. It was not written on the tablets. It was established 84 years ago here in the US. Critics of the 5-day work week back then also predicted doom. They worried that a weekend would destroy the American economy. Instead, it helped launch us to the front of the global pack. Entire industries of recreation and leisure were born. The American middle class became the envy of the world. And the weekend became the time when families and communities came together. With a century of profound changes in our workforce and technology, with AI looming on the horizon, it is time for a much-needed update.
If only a fraction of what technologists promise for the future is true, within a very few years, automation can and should make possible a 4-day work week. The reduction of the work week to 35 or 30 hours in the coming decade can be an important shock absorber during the transition to the widespread use of automation. It can both reduce the impact of sharp rises in output and increase the manpower requirements in industry and commerce. End of quote. And yet today, nearly 70 years later, despite an explosion, as we all know, in technology and a massive increase in worker productivity, nothing has changed. Think about that. Think of the huge transitions we have seen in the economy, but in terms of the work week, nothing has changed. While we have not discussed this issue for a long time in Congress, this is not, needless to say, a new issue. In 1886, one of the central planks of the trade union movement in America was to establish an 8-hour work day with a simple and straightforward demand, quote, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what you will, end quote. That was back in 1886. Americans of that era were sick and tired of working 12-hour days for 6 or 7 days a week with very little time for rest, relaxation, or quality time with their families. They went out on strike, they organized, they petitioned the government and business owners, and they achieved real results after decades of struggle. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson signed legislation into law to establish an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. 6 years later, the Ford Motor Company became one of the first major employers in America to establish a 5-day work week for auto workers. And here is something I believe that most people in our country do not know. In 1933, the United States Senate overwhelmingly passed legislation to establish a 30-hour work week by a vote of 53 to 30. That was 1933. While that legislation ultimately failed as a result of intense opposition from corporate America, a few years later, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act into law, and a 40-hour work week was established in 1940. My friends, in 1940. Unbelievably, 84 years later, despite massive growth in technology and worker productivity, millions of workers in our country are working longer hours for lower wages. And I hope people hear this, because it's not an issue we talk about enough. In 2022, employees in the United States, and I hope people hear this, logged 204 more hours a year than employees in Japan, and they're hardworking people in Japan. 279 more hours than workers in the United Kingdom, and 470 more hours than workers in Germany. Despite these long hours, the average worker in America makes almost $50 a week less than he or she did 50 years ago after adjusting for inflation. American workers are now over 400% more productive than they were in the 1940s. Extraordinary. Technology has made working people far more productive. And what has been the result of all of that productivity increase for working people? Almost all of the economic gains of that technological transformation have gone straight to the top, while wages for workers have remained stagnant or even worse. While CEOs today are making 350 times as much as their average employees, workers throughout the country are seeing their family life fall apart as they are forced to spend more and more time at work. They're missing their kids' birthday parties, Little League, baseball games, and just the time they need with their family. And what stresses them out even further is that after spending all of this time at work, many of them still are living paycheck to paycheck, can't take care of their basic needs. At a moment in history when artificial intelligence and robotics, and I hope we all understand that the jobs that people have today ain't going to be there in many cases in 15 years. This is not a radical idea. France, the 7th largest economy in the world, has a 35-hour work week and is considering a 32-hour work week. Norway and Denmark is their work week is about 37 hours, and Belgium has already adopted a 4-day work week. And what we're going to hear today is there are companies all over our country and all over the world that have adopted the 40-hour work week. And you know what they found? They found that productivity actually went up because workers were able to focus on their work. They were not exhausted. They were happy to go to work. So the issue that we are talking about today is of enormous importance. Who benefits from the exploding technology? The wealthiest people who are doing phenomenally well, or working people who are falling behind.
The government mandating a 32-hour work week requiring businesses to increase pay at least an extra 25% per hour would, frankly, destroy some employers. They would ship those jobs overseas, or they would automate to replace those workers for whom they have an increased expense, or they would dramatically increase prices to make this stay afloat. Now, we've talked about the Biden economics leading to inflation. This would be napalm upon the fire of inflation. If this policy is implemented, it would threaten millions of small businesses operating on a razor-thin margin because they're unable to find enough workers.
We have a mental health crisis we talk about a lot in this country, but we never talk about the causes of that. You know, there's been studies done. You know, increases in stress from working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, you're sacrificing family life, things you want to pursue. It causes an increase in cortisol levels, which lead to heart disease, cancer, strokes. You know, but given all those facts, if someone is lucky enough to get to retire, typically when they've worked themselves to death their entire life, they face knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulder surgeries, and the rest of their lives figuring out how they're going to survive. So, you know, it's sad to say that in 1933, the U.S. Senate passed legislation to establish a 30-hour work week, but due to intense corporate opposition, that legislation failed. But in 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, establishing a 40-hour work week. 84 years ago, the 40-hour week was established. And since then, we've had a 400% increase in productivity, but nothing's changed.
The average American is on the job 400 more hours a year than in Germany, 200 more than in France, the Netherlands, the UK, and more than the average Japanese. This is despite the U.S. historically being the global leader in work time reduction and the world's first 5-day week country. Now, this was the situation when the pandemic hit, which brought with it extraordinary levels of stress and burnout, the Great Resignation, and historically high job vacancies. In response, an increasing number of employers are shifting to a 4-day, 32-hour week with no reduction in pay. I was asked to lead research on their experiences in collaboration with an NGO called 4-Day Week Global. To date, more than 300 companies around the world have taken part in our trials. While the majority are white-collar firms, they do include all sectors: healthcare, mom-and-pop restaurants, manufacturing, construction, retail, nonprofits, IT, finance, professional services, and even a police department in Golden, Colorado. In the U.S., 78% of these are small businesses with 50 or fewer employees, which is similar to the U.S. economy. Our results have been extremely positive for both workers and the companies. We have 26 well-being measures for more than 3,600 employees, every one of which registers improvement from baseline to the end of the trial. Nearly 60% of employees experience better work-family balance. Anxiety, sleep problems, fatigue, physical and mental health improve for 40% of workers. 69% of employees have lower burnout scores. Participants tell us that the new schedule is, quote, life-changing. One person reports that had it not been for the pilot, I wouldn't have had the time or the availability to get medical appointments and procedures, which ultimately led to the early detection of something that might have proved fatal. That something was cancer. If the U.S. adopts a 4-day week, a 32-hour week, it is likely that hourly productivity will rise. That has been the experience of both workers and management in our trials. It is historically what scholars have concluded from past reductions in work time. And it accords with international comparisons. The countries with the highest levels of per-hour productivity are those with the shortest working hours. I began my remarks by referencing our fourfold increase in productivity. The fact that so little of that productivity increase has been put toward reducing hours has left American workers suffering from burnout and stress, with families in special jeopardy.
As the Chief Strategy Officer at Kickstarter, I bring a unique perspective to this panel, having both implemented and experienced a 4-day work week in our company of 118 employees. And the results of our pilot were clear. Our goal achievement rate soared from 62% to 95%. Customer response times and satisfaction ratings stayed the same. Employee retention increased from 82% to 98%, all while reducing average weekly working hours by 9 hours a week for each employee. We made the decision to stick with the 4-day work week and have kept it for 2 years. The most profound change, however, has been the impact to our employees. In just 2 years, we've been able to return nearly 10,000 days to our 118 employees. That's more than 27 years. Those are years of spending time with family and their children, volunteering in their communities, learning new skills, and taking care of their health. The value of that time is priceless and ultimately has been the greatest outcome of our transition to a 4-day work week.
You know, the fundamental question here that we're asking is, where has all this wealth gone that has been gathered in this economy from these massive increases in productivity? If it hasn't been going to workers, if the UAW and other unions have to fight tooth and nail just to be able to get living wage increases. I will tell you something we haven't talked about yet. A lot of that money is going to trust funds. A lot of that money is going into inherited wealth. And at some point, we should have a conversation about that a little bit more openly as a committee and as a Congress. Here's a stunning piece of data. For the first time last year, the majority of wealth for new billionaires, these were people who became billionaires in 2023, came not from their work, but through inheritance. It's the first time ever that that's happened. 1,000 billionaires are expected to pass down $5.2 trillion worth of wealth to their heirs in the next 20 years. And so you hope that if the money isn't going to the workers, it's at least being recycled back into the economy. It's just not true. A lot of that money is being hoarded and then passed down to kids who, in previous ages would not have been able to enjoy that level of benefit from their parents' success. Mr. Fain, I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about leisure time. You've talked about this already. I think you really importantly talk about the importance that your faith plays in the work that you do and in your life. There's a pretty wild thing happening in America today. In 2000, 70% of Americans belong to a religious institution, but today that number is 50%. This has been a pretty precipitous decline in the ability or willingness of Americans to go to church or to a religious institution on a regular basis. And I think that has lots of broad impacts in our society. But there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of them is that Americans just have less free time. When you have to work 70 hours to get the same standard of living for your family that 40 hours would have gotten you a few decades ago, you don't have time to go to Wednesday night Bible study. You might not have the ability to even attend church or services on a Sunday. You can talk about church if you want or if you don't want, but it is just true that some of the leisure time activities, some of the institutions that Americans found value and meaning in are less accessible when you have to work these long hours. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest, it's one of the things we talked about with the 32-hour work week when we put that in our contract talks was the fact that we wanted to create work-life balance. Because it's just, in this country, we are the most productive, I mean, sadly, I say, not proudly, sadly, we are the most productive nation in the world, which means our people are working more and more hours with less and less people, and something's got to give. And so, it's work-life balance. And as I say, when you're working multiple jobs to live paycheck to paycheck, or you're working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, something else is sacrificed in that, and it's what ends up happening. You have to sacrifice, ability to go to church. If it's something else to do on a Sunday, maybe you get a Sunday off and you haven't slept all week and you spend the whole day sleeping. I mean, that is a reality a lot of workers face on some of the schedules they work. The thing to me that I think, I hear all this, we've heard my whole life about good for business is good for people, trickle-down economics and all those type things. But to me, we have to focus, I do believe Congress has an obligation here in spending priorities and regulations. And that may be an ugly word to some people that represent business. But, the point of this is this should be done to create more jobs at a better rate of pay so that people have more free time to live. And, if government's going to invest in business, the trillions of dollars we invest in business, that our taxpayer dollars invest in business, those benefits should be going to working class people, not just strictly business. And that's the problem. All this money goes to business, but it never seems to funnel its way down to benefit working class people.
But the point of this hearing is to try to raise at the congressional level something that has not been discussed here for decades after decades. And I think as all of us have understood, we are living in a difficult moment in American history. We have more income and wealth inequality than we have ever had before. Senator Murphy made the interesting point that for the billionaire class, now a majority of that wealth is being not earned by any case, but being transferred to children, unearned income, if you like. We're seeing CEOs making 350 times more than their workers, while 60% of the people in America are living paycheck to paycheck. We have the highest level of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. Many of our older people finding it hard to retire. So we've got to start asking some fundamental questions. This is an extraordinary wealthy country, but three people on top, as Mr. Fain mentioned, own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. According to the Rand Corporation, over the last 50 years, and Rand Corporation is not exactly a socialist organization. Over the last 50 years, $50 trillion has gone from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. So in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, the vast majority of our people are struggling to put food on the table. are living under incredible stress. Our life expectancy is significantly lower, as you know, than other countries. And for working class people, if you're working class in this country, you're going to live 10 years fewer than you will if you are upper class. These are issues that have got to be discussed. I'm not suggesting that a 32-hour work week is going to change all of that. But one of the issues that we have got to talk about is stress in this country, the fact that so many people are going to work exhausted, physically and mentally. And the fact that we have not changed the Fair Labor Standards Act. This was in 1940. We came up with a 40-hour work week. 1940. Who is going to deny that the economy has not fundamentally and radically changed over that period of time? So to suggest that we have to maintain what we put in place 84 years ago does not make a lot of sense to me. So let me just conclude by thanking all of our excellent panelists. It's been a good discussion. I hope the discussion continues. And thank you all very much for being here today. For any senators who wish to ask additional questions for the record will be due in 10 business days. I ask unanimous consent to enter the record 2 statements in support of shortened work weeks, including a statement from Congressman Takano and business owners across the country. The committee stands adjourned.